So hello and welcome. This is the first of our Ideas at SFUBeedie series on the topic of governance that addresses community values. I'm Stephanie Birtles. I'm the director of our Center for Corporate Governance and Sustainability, and it is my absolute pleasure to act as the moderator for today's session. Before I begin, as faculty at Beedie, we live and work as uninvited guests in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories and homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, the Coquitlam, Squamish, and Musqueam nations. And I know for me, this comes with a responsibility to cultivate meaningful relationships and contribute to the sustainability of this beautiful and wonderful place. So this marks the 40th anniversary of the official formation of the business school at Simon Fraser University this year. And as part of our celebrations, we have launched Ideas at SFUBeedie. It's a webinar series to showcase the thought leadership of our faculty as they share their insights on some of the most important issues of our time. This is the first of this exciting series, and today we focus on the interface of companies and communities. We're delighted to welcome attendees from within British Columbia, across Canada, and internationally right around the world today. 3 of our SFUBeedie School of Business faculty will discuss how governance mechanisms may need to adapt to better reflect community values. So today we'll begin with insights from our faculty. Feel free to add questions or comments into the Zoom comment box at any time throughout the session, and I'll do my best to bring them forward. At this time, we'll ask participants to mute and remain muted during this portion. But given that this series is meant to be a chance to both reconnect and to engage with research work being undertaken by the faculty, we'll break into a few smaller salons later, hosted by one of each of our 4 faculty, to provide a chance to delve a bit deeper and draw in some of your knowledge and experience. At that time, if you're able, we'll invite you to share your video and join in the conversation. And then we're going to return back to our full plenary to share the knowledge and insights that we gained. So let's begin. Businesses are under increasing pressure to be more reflective of the communities where they operate and to ensure that they contribute positively to them. It's my pleasure to introduce 3 of my favorite faculty colleagues, they're all my favorites, that are undertaking leading research in this area. Dr. Dara Kelly is Assistant Professor of Indigenous Business. Her research helps to shed light on the economic concepts and practices of the Coast Salish and other Indigenous nations. Dara is from the Lekalm First Nation, part of the Stolo Coast Salish. Dr. Peng Zhang is Assistant Professor of Managerial Economics. Peng's research sits at the nexus between international business strategy and development economics, with a focus on emerging economies and particularly those in Africa. And Dr. Eric Worker is the William Saywell Professor. Eric studies how countries can build more thriving and inclusive private sectors and how external actors influence economic and political outcomes. So our conversation today explores how governance expectations are shifting, especially as it relates to corporate community relations, and as a result, how approaches to governance may need to also shift, especially for companies that are operating in emerging economies and in the territories of Indigenous peoples. Let's start by setting the stage. So Dara, Peng, Eric, from your own research work, can you each help us to understand the pressures on companies to better align their governance with community values? And where have traditional approaches to corporate governance fallen short, and what is creating momentum for a shift? So Dara, I'll ask you first, please.
So thank you, Stephanie. Swal. Nice to meet and see all of you. So as Stephanie said, I come from the Lekaml First Nation. And so a lot of the knowledge that I bring into these conversations comes from, cultural knowledge that I have from within my family. So it's important, I think, to begin when we start to think about these questions around governance. In Canada, when Indigenous nationhood and sovereignty is fully recognized, there are multiple forms of governance. And so I'm talking about the forms of governance that exist for Indigenous nations that were in existence prior to colonization. And these are the structures that allowed us to govern ourselves, govern our lands, and govern our economies. These governance structures continue to exist for many nations, and we're able to reference these very old structures of knowledge due to the efforts of elders and wisdom keepers and the kinship structures that preserved Indigenous governance by way of oral history. So I know that this is part of the knowledge tradition within my family, and I can credit my great-grandmother as somebody who helped to keep that governance knowledge alive. Canada's legacy of colonization had a massive impact on these governance structures. First, by trying to dismantle them and erase them from history, and then second, by writing and legalizing colonial governance over top of those Indigenous systems. So this informs our current systems of governance in Canada today, and also the current conversation that is emerging around ESG. There's been some incredible research coming out, incredible reports. One of them is by the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, released in January of 2021. The report is called Indigenous Sustainable Investment, Discussing Opportunities in ESG. The authors highlight that there's changes, that the changes within the legal landscape with new legislation coming into both Canada and the province of BC, enshrining, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into law. This is significantly shifting corporate attention on Indigenous peoples and resources from being about community engagement to being a corporate governance issue. So it moved from something to think about to something that can have very expensive legal and regulatory consequences. So just to go to the second half of that question, Stephanie, what I find interesting about governance right now is how ongoing policies in the present day continue to hinder Indigenous wealth and well-being. And can we imagine what the untapped potential of Indigenous communities could be if we were to reorganize and capture that underlying power within good governance structures in a different way? There's plenty of folks doing this within the legal sector, but in business and economic areas, it is a newer conversation. I also ask questions around, what, from an Indigenous perspective, what would constitute risks and liabilities? This is a governance question, and may look really different if you ground that in Indigenous knowledge structures. And then, of course, the long-term intergenerational view is something that, if you think about 7 generations or a 500-year planning structure, how then would your governance really shift within that framework? So thank you. I'd love to hear from Peng.
Thank you very much, Dara. Actually, what I'm going to say echoes a lot of what you have said in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. So let me first share what kind of research I've been doing in terms of community values. And then I talk about how my research challenges some of the traditional approach to corporate governance. Multinational corporations were founded in Western society with individualistic, industrialized, and democratic feature. So in one of the popular books by Joseph Henrich, he described this kind of culture as being weird, because if you look at the whole human history, or if you look at all sorts of cultures across the world, this individualistic culture is only a small part. So majority of the world, their culture is not like that. The implication for corporate governance is if your corporate governance is based on this individualistic culture, it may be functioning very well in your home country. But then when you go to the international market, chances are very large that you're gonna encounter a very different institutional environment. So what you have learned in your home country may not be applicable in the market you are operating at. Therefore, because of the importance of community cultures, you can imagine there are a lot of discussions about social norms, cultural values in the business world. And those values, norms, in the economics term, it's defined as informal institutions. So I'm not the only scholar who is working on this topic. So what is my own contribution to the whole conversations about community value and corporate governance? So basically, I'm going to answer two questions through my research project. So first, we know community values are different across space. So the question will be, what drives the difference? Why some culture is more individualistic than the others? So this is an important question to ask because the answer relates to the second question. So if the difference of culture is driven by something fundamental in the society, even if the society has changed over time, this fundamental structure may still persist. So what the types of culture or social norms many years ago may still have persistent effect on contemporary business. So to answer the first question, we need to find a context with a lot of heterogeneity or variation of social norms and culture we can identify. So a typical context is the sub-Saharan African society. And to answer the second question, we need to find the business sector where the effect of social norms or culture would be the strongest. And eventually, we decide to focus on informal firms, which are the firms not registered with the government. So you can imagine if there is a formal firm registered with Ministry of Commerce, their governance will be affected by a lot of factors, including social norms and the rule of laws, commercial laws, governance, all sorts of factors. So it's difficult to disentangle the factor of informal institutions. So this is what I have been doing, looking at different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So the black borders are the boundaries of countries. So one striking fact, the first time I look at this map, is within each country, you can see you have a lot of small polygons, and each polygon refers to an ethnic group, and each group can have very different culture. So it's like, if we go back to Dara's story in British Columbia, we look at indigenous people, they are not homogeneous. They have different group with different culture, and each culture should be respected. So this is the similar case in sub-Saharan Africa, very big heterogeneity across, even within the same country, very big heterogeneity in terms of culture. Now we know the setting. So my answer to the two questions I asked at the beginning. So first, what determines social norms and culture? To look at the fundamental determinants, we basically need to look at the fundamental unit of society, that is the family. And we know society consists of all sorts of families, and families relate to each other by marriage or inheritance. So that means ultimately the way you practice your marriage within the society will largely affect your social norms and culture. So one dimension in this line of conversation is to look at one particular type of marriage practice, that is who you marry to. So in the nuclear family system, in the exogamous family, the tradition, you basically, there's no restriction about who you can marry. You can marry someone within your group or outside your group. But there's also a type of culture with more endogamous family marriage practice. So which means you are encouraged to marry your cousin within your kinship tie. So how this affects culture ultimately? Imagine if within the society, you have families marrying each other, you have this close cousin marriage. Eventually, this kinship network is going to be very strong. There is a lot of cooperation, coherence, and solidarity within your kinship. So that means when you make decisions, you put a lot of emphasis on the social group, on the kinship you are operating at. So the group identity, your group benefit will be a large part of your culture. While on the other hand, in the more individualistic culture, you have much higher frequency of interacting, trading with people outside your community. So your decision-making will be more market-oriented. And also because ultimately your culture, this culture is determined by family structure, the kinship structure, which is very stable over time. So this means the effect of this marriage practice will be very persistent. So this is the first question. Marriage practice ultimately affects culture. The second question is, what is the effect? How this culture relates to corporate governance. So this is the result of my research. So let me just summarize here. So basically what happens is, imagine in the endogamous society, people connect to each other based on cousin marriage. The kinship tie is very strong. Your decision-making is based on the family's, the social group's welfare, your kinship members' welfare. That means once you have more resource to make your business better, where are you going to spend your resource? What you care about is basically, can I help other members in my kinship network? Can I create more jobs for people within my social group? So that means as long as you have more resource, your governance structure will be operated in the way that you try to create more jobs for your kinship. So your employment size will increase once you have more resource. On the other hand, if you look at the exogamy, the nuclear family structure, there are many more market transactions between you and the people outside your group. So your decision-making will be more market-oriented. So typically, the way we measure business outcome like revenue or profit, those measures will be the purpose of your business. So to summarize, you have different culture. One has more value on market structure. One is based more on social group, your kinship network. Eventually, they will affect the ultimate purpose of your company. So what do we learn from this research and why my research challenges some of the traditional approaches to corporate governance? So first, corporate governance is a way to organize your resource and the structure, the process in order to achieve a goal of a company. So the fundamental question is, what is the goal of your company? And if we look at standard economics textbook, all the models will start with companies maximizing profit or revenue. And this research basically shows it's not always the case, especially in the communities with very strong kinship network. The ultimate purpose, the first order importance for firms can be different. So for example, in my case, to create more jobs for people in your kinship network. So second, when we look at community values, we basically, a lot of times we look at what people are doing nowadays. What is the contemporary culture or social norm? So what I'm showing here basically is it's not only about what we are doing contemporarily, but also something which happened many, many years ago can still shape our business performance. So in some of the communities I study in sub-Saharan Africa, they used to have the endogamy practice. They are no longer having cousin marriage practice, but still you can see because of during those many years of endogamy tradition, they have this more social group oriented culture, and that still has persistent effect on nowadays business. So you do have to look at the past, see what people have done, not only say what they are doing right now. And the third is how to define the community. So at first, people think groups from different countries or different cities, they may have different social norms or culture. Here, what we are showing basically is community is defined, can be defined in a more nuanced way. So even within the same country or city, you can see you have different types of ethnic groups, and each group can have their distinctive culture. So it doesn't have to be, the definition of community doesn't have to be consistent with administrative borders. So just three takeaways for the discussion here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peng. Oh, this is great. We're already getting this idea that it's an intersection between values of communities and what helps to shape those values, that there's going to be an important relationship between the governance structures that we use and how those enable and constrain how communities can be able to act on their values. So Eric, I turn it over to you for your initial thoughts on this.
Great. Well, thanks. And thanks, Dara and Peng. I just wanted to build on that. I'd say it happens all the time that companies do business and need to take community values into account. Let me mention a couple of examples, one of which is more of a dilemma at the global level, which kind of references the trade-off that Peng described between profitability and serving profitability and values. And the second is more an innovation at the very local level, which is around, references Dara's discussion around doing business in traditional and unceded territories and the legal changes that are occurring, referencing past governance practices. So the global level, in strategy, we teach how firms come up with mission, vision, and value statements that should serve to give them strategic direction as well as build constituencies of like-minded people. And many businesses have values-driven internal policies that are really responsive to their primary community of customers, investors, and employees. But of course, these companies need to respond to the national political and legal context. A pretty stark example of when those values of the sort of the primary constituents of a business might come into conflict has occurred with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, where we saw dozens of Western firms essentially shutter or pull out or divest from their businesses in Russia, in spite of the profitability that they could have enjoyed by continuing there. We saw McDonald's and Starbucks close their stores, KPMG, PwC sever their relationships with the businesses that had been their local subsidiaries. And there could be a number of pressures for this, including on stock prices. But I think just ignoring the fact that there were values shared by their global customers and by their employees that would have been inconsistent with continuing to operate affected those decisions. Similarly, we see the dilemmas in the tech sector that thrive and build their communities of customers around the open sharing of information. And when that comes up against countries like in China that are making it harder to share content without coming up against content regulation, like when we saw LinkedIn tried for a while. With LinkedIn, it's about workers and firms and professional opportunities, but it also includes a lot of sharing of content, and that was hard for their Chinese business. And so they recently decided to close that and to reopen a much more narrow one that's just focused around essentially jobs and candidates, rather than go against the values that they had around being able to share content openly. So, it's not a perfect resolution. And we've seen the tech firms that kind of thrive on information communities manage those dilemmas in different ways. Now, let me talk about a much more local example. And here I'm going to reference the backdrop I have here. This is from the town of Kanbod in Mongolia in the South Gobi region, which is near the Oyu Tolgoi copper gold mine that's run by Rio Tinto, and actually was started by Ivanhoe, a sort of Vancouver-based mining company. And I co-wrote a case on this, and I teach it in my strategy class. And the innovation here is around the fact that mining and other extractive operations tend to have a very strong local impact on a community that's very tangible. That could include negative impacts, including especially environmental, but also socially and culturally. And traditionally, I'm using that word probably the wrong way, but in the past few decades or past century, companies would get the permission to mine or to do an extractive project from a federal or provincial authority. And they might, in an extreme example, show up and have the local community not really have been consulted or have given permission for that activity to occur. In Liberia, where I've worked as an economic advisor, this happened fairly recently around palm oil. The Malaysian palm oil giant Sime Darby signed a concession with the Liberian government that gave them the right to use up to 300,000 hectares of land in specific areas of the countries for palm oil plantations. And they'd show up and there'd be a village in the middle of that area, and the villagers' leadership and community members had no idea that the government had essentially signed their rights away. So an innovation that's occurred here that started in Australia, quickly moved to Canada, and has since spread around the world, including to Mongolia, in part through the efforts of nonprofits and transnational advocacy groups, where we see an institution emerge in one place and then spread to others, is the signing of local level agreements between the company that's doing the mining and then the community and their representatives. And in Canada, these are called impact and benefit agreements. The agreements tend to address both impact, the negative impact and how those can be mitigated, as well as benefits. If there's a project that will create economic value, how can those be shared in a way that compensates the community for the activity and the negative impacts that they experience? And in some countries like Canada and now Mongolia, thanks to those transnational advocacy efforts, there's either a legal or a de facto requirement for agreements to occur. Now, how do governance and community values come into play here? Well, one of the aspects is around the governance of the agreements. So in version 1.0 of these agreements, there were structures that were set up to govern the agreement, how the two parties interact with one another, and how the distribution of benefits, especially if it's in the form of financial contributions to a trust fund, say, would be governed, and then how those funds can be spent on community development projects. And in version 2.0 that we're seeing more in particular in areas in which there's very strong Indigenous rights over the use of the resource, such as in Canada's Arctic. An example is the Baffinland iron ore project in Nunavut, which is under the jurisdiction of the Kikitani Inuit Authority. It's not just governance around the agreement and the distribution of benefits or impact mitigation, but around the project itself. And so what we see here is, in particular, the community is involved in participating in the monitoring of the environmental impact, and then ideally has some say and regulation over the activity itself. I'll stop there.
Thanks. I think it's so interesting, and as I'm listening, Eric, I'm also struck as I reflect back on the purpose and the mission and value that you talked about, and that Peng raised as well, is that it's interesting to see how corporate governance structures are going to need to adjust in order to think about what that broader purpose might be. And certainly investors like BlackRock and others have been pushing this now for a couple of years to say that companies need to think about what their societal purpose is. And so then that will have implications, of course, then for how we think about corporate governance. And so I want to invite our participants, and just as a reminder that you're welcome to make your own comments and introduce your questions in the chat. We will be breaking out a little bit later to explore some of these ideas in a bit more depth, but I wanted to dig in a little bit more. Dara, what do you think that companies that are operating in Indigenous territories need to consider when it comes to corporate governance?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are asking this question right now. So there's a couple of different pieces to this. So I think there's a lot of talk about representation on boards with regards to diversity and inclusion. I know that, my father is involved with a lot of governance in different capacities in Canada. And I know that, we've had lots of conversations about this idea of Indigenous representation. One of the points of tension, I think, that comes up is, if you have an Indigenous person on your board, is it their responsibility to understand solely, as a sort of expert on the board, that the fiduciary responsibilities that come with the considerations that I've already alluded to, which is, there's, understanding what are the legal implications of these new pieces of legislation now, what are the risks that are actually involved, and I know that it's not the Indigenous person's responsibility actually to carry that fiduciary responsibility. It's the entire board, right? And so there's a learning curve that then comes with, if you invite an Indigenous person into that space, that yes, there's a certain expertise that they bring, but it's also not their job, right, to carry the liability with that. So I think it's important then, for, if you're going to take this seriously, that it's the entire corporate structure that needs to be taking this seriously and getting the knowledge base level up. I think that there's also, a lot of conversation about ESG measures. And one of the things I know, Stephanie, you and I have encountered in different conversations is where these standards are developed. If they're developed in the UK or anywhere in the EU or in the US, that often these local conversations, or the ways that Indigenous rights are asserted locally, certainly within BC, it's difficult to take those standards and make them have actual meaning in a really concrete way. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration, that if you're going to take ESG seriously, that it's often not sufficient. And then in terms of considering things like relationality, right? So if we think about Indigenous relations, Indigenous and corporate relations, I think that there's, it's been quite a rocky road, to be honest. In Canada, it's, we see the end result, which is when they end up in legal battles, and that's the costly approach that I think should be avoided, right? And it's about taking a different approach and understanding to what constitutes a good relationship. The idea of truly good governance is about engaging seriously in respectful dialogue, in bringing that sense of corporate ethics. What are your ethics as a company? Really saying, does that work when you go to the table to have a conversation with Indigenous nations or hereditary leaders? And that might need to be adjusted, and it also is about asking that question: what is the governance structure of Indigenous folks on the other side of that table, who you may want to invite, and you're trying to build a partnership? how are you going to understand who your partner is if you really don't even understand what their identity and their decades and hundreds of years and thousands of years of lineage is all about? That matters. That's what's driving so much of the way that decisions play out, because there's a whole lot of governance that is happening often behind the scenes, right? And I think that that's what's so important to understand, is that even though you may have sort of business and corporate governance, there's a whole world of Indigenous governance that is operating at the same time. So I think I'll leave it there.
Oh, thanks, Tara. And Peng, I have a similar question for you then, is, you know, from the research that you've been doing, what are the lessons learned from the governance in the informal economy that might carry over to companies in the formal economy and help them think about how their governance structures can be better adapted to be more representative of community values?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think I can answer your question in two ways. So first, say to clarify, I didn't have much time to talk about informal firms. So those firms stay unregistered with the government for many reasons. So typically, say the regulatory burden is too high. It takes too much time and effort to get a business license. So in the end, they chose to be unregistered. So this means the informal firms are not necessarily very small firms, only family business. So they can range from very small to large firms, which means to some extent, the informal firms you observe in those emerging economies, say sub-Saharan Africa, are not that different from formal firms in terms of the business problems they have to solve, the structure, the organization structure they have. Also, for even formal firms in emerging economies, in a lot of cases, the institution is weak in those countries, which means although there is a commercial law, although there is a regulation or governance, it's hard to implement such laws. So in the end, for even formal firms, they have to rely a lot on the community value or social norms to govern them in a more informal way. So to this extent, what we learn from informal firms, the knowledge can be transferred to formal firms, given they operate in similar environment, they have similar institutions and the structures. So this is one way we can think of. Another way is if you look at formal firms in more developed economies, say Canada, North America, or Europe, our research is also very helpful because this actually relates to the second topic of the series about global value chain in the future. So because of this supply chain, because of this global value chain, the global production network, you can imagine a lot of formal firms, even in the developed economy, they can collaborate with informal firms in developing countries. So for example, they can outsource some of the production to those informal sectors, or the informal firms operate as a subcontractor for the formal firms. So basically, in the end, even a Canadian firm is likely to have collaboration with an informal firm in an emerging economy. So if they are your collaborators, the important thing is you have to understand those informal firms, your business partners, what drives their motivation, and what is the target of those firms. How can we do to build a sustainable relationship between a formal firm and an informal firm? So this is why I think what we learned in the informal sector in some special institutional environment can be generalized to a lot of business environments.
Thanks, Peng. Eric, I guess I'm wondering, you talked about these instruments that can help to bridge between the governance of resources between communities and companies. And so do you think that those instruments can be better designed to align with community values?
Sure. Yeah, I think what my research has shown, along with a number of co-authors, is that even the, I guess, most celebrated community benefit sharing agreements or impact and benefit agreements have opportunities to do better and to better represent community structures. We studied a celebrated agreement in Ghana between Newmont, which is an American gold mining company, and the Ahafo community in central western Ghana. The agreement had set up a community level forum and various committees and subcommittees to govern the agreement and allocate the funds that had been promised from the company. They basically promised 1% of profits and $1 per ounce of each ounce of gold sold to the community that could then be utilized for community development purposes. And now we'd recognize that as a multi-stakeholder institution because the governance structures set up by the agreement included representatives from the community, from the company, and the government. What we found in looking at the research by speaking with many community members and understanding their perception of how 10 years later this agreement had actually gone, we found there had been poor representation at the time of negotiation and in subsequent decision-making. There was pretty weak participation and communication, even between representatives from the community and their constituents that they were meant to represent. There were clauses left unexercised, including around participatory environmental monitoring. And maybe most interestingly, at least for political economists like myself, we found that there was unequal power even amongst people who purportedly were all there as representatives in this multi-stakeholder institution. And the local elites and the company representatives, which I suppose ironically would have been the groups who would have negotiated informally in the absence of this new innovative structure around having an agreement, were the ones who still had the most power exercised even through these new institutions. In the Oyu Tolgoi example behind me, here, as I mentioned, the practice of doing local level agreements was brought to Mongolia through transnational activism, but it was also brought by the company. In this case, Rio Tinto, when it came time to sign the agreement with the local communities, who were not, in this case, indigenous communities, but kind of, I'd suppose, the closest thing to a municipality and a county in a North American context. The law required that an agreement be signed, and the investment agreement that the company had signed at the national level, which covered things like taxes and royalties and so on, also stipulated that an agreement be signed, but they didn't really say what had to be done. It's just kind of a vague thing. And other companies, some local Mongolian companies, might have satisfied that just by building a new school, for example, and then moving on. But what emerged in this case was this 90-page document of a whole set of clauses and kind of benefit sharing opportunities, which look pretty much like Rio Tinto's agreements in Australia or Canada. And so you might say, oh, this is great. You know, there's a new comprehensive thing brought in, but you might also say that this wasn't responsive to the local context and it didn't emerge relative to the community values in the Gobi region in Mongolia. And yeah, so that's sort of, I suppose, a mixed bag. So some recommendations that's come from the research is, one is to try to align the benefits and impact mitigation in these agreements with the community narratives around values. In the Ahafo case in Ghana, what the community members told us is there was a very strong narrative. They were being asked to give up their land for this mine, and in exchange they wanted to have employment in the modern, good paying jobs in the mine. But what the company offered instead was profit sharing, a very small amount, just 1%, where it was almost like, Southwest employees get shares in the company. So when the company does well, the employees do well, and therefore they're motivated to come to work every day, which was probably the same belief that Newmont had when they signed that agreement in Ghana. But actually the people in the community wanted jobs as opposed to a share of the profits in the mine. A second recommendation is, in order to align expectations around, is this going to change our lives? Is there going to be a financial gold rush? Or is it going to be, much of the same with some environmental impact down the road? One thing that a colleague at Mark Moore and I at SFUBeedie have done working with an indigenous association in the Arctic, is to project out the expected benefits from the agreements to be able to advise monitoring and evaluation going forward. So that could set out the expectations as well as identify the key variables that would be expected to realize changes for the community. And ideally, those variables are chosen and represented in the agreement itself to reflect community priorities and values. A third recommendation is to engage the community with the project itself and not just the relationship and how to spend compensation, such as through environmental monitoring. And then hopefully in the future, as that experience is built, into other aspects of the management of the project. And then finally, as the example from Ghana alludes, to be able to use political economy analysis in setting up a governance structure if one does need to be created. Because as Dara has mentioned, there are existing governance structures. You don't always see it, but it's there. And just imposing kind of a cookie cutter portable, oh, this will represent community values because it's, representative because it has constituents and representatives, and therefore community values will be surfaced through this agreement, I think is ultimately naive, and every context can have different values, and then also political dynamics that can change how those values end up getting communicated even to a well-intentioned business.
Yeah, thanks. As I was listening, I was thinking about my own research and my own discussions with companies, and how many of them are making that transition to realize that that they need to take the time to better understand the governance structures of the communities where they operate, but also to understand those communities' priorities, whether it's things like the dignity of decent work, as you were talking about. But we've also seen how difficult that can be, because companies urgently want to move forward. And so they come to communities, and they want communities to participate in this process of articulating their priorities. And sometimes the priority of that community, very often the priority of that community, is not articulating those values. It's dealing with very real issues on the ground related to health and education and work and all sorts of other issues. Environmental crises or whatever it is that they're facing. So I think it is, patience maybe is another thing that is going to have to emerge in terms of these relationships, and realizing that they're not transactions, but exactly that, a longer term relationship that companies are going to need to set up over time. So I'll invite again to see if there are questions that others want to tackle. But in the meantime, Dara, I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, if there are lessons from the traditional governance practices of the Coast Salish peoples that might help us think about how to better structure this shared governance of resources.
Mm-hmm. I can speak to this from my own data, but also one of the pieces that I always loved to that I learned while I was in New Zealand is this principle of it's called kaitiakitanga, which is a Māori word, which is about reframing the mindset of scarcity. So instead of thinking about resources as being scarce, and therefore, we need to manage that scarcity, the principle of abundance is about then shifting to thinking about how do we protect what is currently abundant, right? And so that guardianship principle, then it gets built into the governance decision-making process. That long-term intergenerational thinking, what are the Māori word is taonga, which means your most sacred treasures. So what are the sacred treasures that you are handing to the next generation? And some of those sacred treasures are never to be touched, really, in that essence of changing those treasures. They have to be passed as they are to the next generation. So I like thinking about that as a principle that guides governance, in that sense of, it's like a family heirloom or a gift that we make sure that we have always available. So I think that there's a lot also within, similarly in Coast Salish structures. In the research that I did for my PhD, the ways that I was looking at this idea of the things that get passed down, there's a lot of symbolic and mnemonics that come into play. So, for example, if you are passing down a piece of property, the property is not just transacted, but it's symbolically attached to things like traditional names. And therefore, in order to facilitate that transaction to take place, you have these two pieces. You have to make sure that ceremonially the name is passed with that to whomever you're passing that down. So it's not just the property, it's the name that comes with the property. So I like this because I think about, if you are embedding your transactions and the things that you exchange within a ceremonial context, it changes dramatically how you're going to see the transaction. It becomes something that everybody needs to witness. You begin to see feasting coming into play. You begin to see that aspect of relationship being the front and center, because in essence, the transactions aren't the important pieces. The transactions are part of the system, and the whole system needs to include all of these aspects of relating, of connecting, of being able to strategically decide which relationships you're going to nurture and which ones you aren't. So I think that those were our governance structures that in which all of our economic transactions were actually embedded. And I think I just had my other point there was just that what this also facilitates is that there's a wider inclusive vision of then who is making those decisions, right? It's about bringing in your elders to make sure that you have that legacy knowledge. It's about bringing in the next generation to make sure that knowledge then is carried on. It's about activating all of that hereditary leadership, because everybody's got particular roles. There's a lot of conversation and discussion that precedes the event itself. And so then you have a very fulsome idea of community engagement that is naturally unfolding within Indigenous governance structures. And I think that's, I'd love to see some of that coming forward into the corporate governance in the sense of decision making and the ways that we decide what are the gifts we hand to the future.
Yeah, it's exciting to think about an evolution of corporate governance that moves away from a focus only on the company and the success of the company, to think of itself as embedded more broadly within communities, and thinking about the role that it plays in those communities and how its governance can enable and also benefit from the wisdom from the communities around it. in that spirit, we also want to benefit from your wisdom. You can see that we are a group of scholars, like many at Beedie School of Business, who are engaged in working communities, very much in an active mode of listening and benefiting from that kind of knowledge in order to better understand. And we see this series really as a chance to reconnect with many of you alumni who have joined us on the call, and collaborators and others. So we wanted to head into a few smaller salons. Each will be led by one of the four of us. And we look forward to hearing some of your insights and experiences and reflections on what we've heard, and also how that might shape our own governance and acts of governance in practice. So we'll head into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes, and then we'll be returning for a final conversation, just to wrap up and think about what this means for the future, and the future of governance, and the future of the research that we'll be undertaking around it. So please be patient as we are virtually moved into our little salons, and we'll see you back in a little bit. So welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much. A few of us did a couple of circles, but that was great. We arrived where we arrived in the conversation we were meant to have. And so I thought I would give a chance to check in with the different groups that we had, and hear some of the knowledge that people have to share. I was wondering, Lulumile, you were telling us a little bit in the context of South Africa, and how the consideration of different forms of knowledge and different traditional forms of law has had an impact on governance in those settings. So, hello to the other group who've made their way back. Sorry, I was just inviting Lulumile to share with us the conversation that we had in our little pullout group. So Lulumile, did you want to go ahead? Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Lulamile Makaula. I'm a PhD student at the University of Cape Town. Yeah, so I was in a breakout room with Stephanie Mernick and Steph Bertels, who's my PhD supervisor. So just in summary, so my PhD project is investigating the role of intermediaries in the relationship between mining companies and communities. So I'm doing this in a particular case study of platinum mining operation in South Africa, where a community has actually had to sort of make way over a 90-year period in terms of resettlements to basically make way for mining. So yeah, so back to Steph's question, I think just around governance, and how that actually might be starting to be incorporated into core management, on how companies as well are actually being more sensitive to that. So I think in my data collection, what I'm starting to see, sort of focusing specifically on intermediaries, is that some lawyers, specifically human rights lawyers, are actually using sort of like customary law as a way to basically try and actually defend the rights of communities. So in South Africa, customary law and sort of like the main legal systems, which is basically Dutch common law, is actually held on the same regard. So you might actually find companies that might have reached an agreement, let's say, with the chief, sort of like the most senior person of a traditional community, but then not sort of taken into account the customary law that basically governs of how a chief is supposed to go about consulting the communities. So yeah, so a lot of the judgments, these lawyers have actually won on behalf of communities by arguing that these decision-making processes that take into account customary law have not actually been respected fully. So yeah, so practically in terms of what I've seen like on the ground in terms of company community relations practitioners is when I do go and collect my data, there's a hotel that sometimes I normally stay at. So I'm actually starting to see some of the community relations practitioners actually holding meetings directly with these structures that in the past you wouldn't actually even imagined that they would actually be consulting with. So the word we use in South Africa is the Horo Council, which is like a Sotho word. So basically what that is, it would be like sort of like sub-chiefs or sub-headmen or headwomen and their counselors. And this is basically one of the most representative structures sort of on the ground level, at the village level, that represents communities, yeah. So I think that's just one aspect that I've been seeing from my data. And secondly, it's around a place sort of where communities are embedded. So in these particular communities where I'm collecting my data, meetings actually take place underneath a marula tree. I think those of you that have been to Southern Africa, you know what a marula tree is. It's got this fruit that they use to make this really nice liquor drink. So you're actually seeing mining companies before would actually argue that, yeah, but we can't actually have our PowerPoint presentations underneath the tree, actually taking that seriously and actually going out into the communities and actually having these meetings underneath these trees, and actually just realizing that this is basically where the communities basically meet, yeah. And Steph just gave me an example about Dara's work on an EMBA referring to longhouses, where she will be taking an EMBA to that. So I think that was also quite interesting to hear that in the Canadian space, that you actually have place-specific meeting areas that I think just some interactions are just supposed to are better suited to happen around those spaces, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Lulamile. It's always amazing to think about how these patterns are emerging and how this kind of change in consciousness about corporate governance is starting to unfold as we start to legitimate and recognize a whole lot of different governance structures. I think it offers us a lot of opportunities to think about how we can govern differently and govern in a more inclusive way. Dara, your group, any thoughts or ideas that came out of there that you wanted to share?
Well, 15 minutes went very quickly after all of our bouncing around. So we didn't get through a lot, but so we had both Anders and Deepti both speaking about the impacts of in the Ukraine, and talking about how, I mean, what I got from the comments was a sense that, that there's governance conversations, and that those conversations are immediately tied to what is happening on the ground. That so, talking about social distribution of wealth and benefits, that actually in a crisis, I think the gap between governance and community becomes collapsed almost, where it's just like immediately, moment by moment and day by day, the implications of these kinds of decisions are so real to people's lives every day. So yeah, I'm not and then we all Mitch also was contributing insights about the approach that he takes within his community with regards to impact benefit agreements, and I really appreciated you, Mitch, talking about bringing elders into the negotiation process right away. And part of that, I think, is really about sort of keeping in check those things that we hold sacred, and making sure that that is consistent from start to finish. So yeah, that's where we talked in our conversation.
Oh, that's amazing. Peng, what about your conversation? Are there any things that you want to bring forward, or is there anyone that would like to share?
Yeah, we actually have several to me, very interesting and thought-provoking ideas. And as Dara said, 15 minutes is really short. So I didn't end up asking one of the questions thoroughly. So at the end, I can ask to the whole group, because I think it's a very important question. So there are 3 ideas coming from the discussion. So first, Elsie pointed out a very important part about corporate governance is the long-term perspective. First, it's not easy, especially you come to a new culture, which is different from your home institution. It takes time to learn the culture. And also you can see from my research, not only the contemporary culture matters, but also what happens in the history will shape some of the institutions in the local community. So it's a long-term process of understanding both the contemporary and the past culture and the beliefs. So the second question is from Cousin, who talks about the fragmentation of the community. Say within certain geographic area, what if you have many different ethnic groups having very different views? So for a government or for the for a company, is there any way to tackle? Is there any way to find a consensus between those groups? There is no ultimate solution yet, because a lot of research shows there is the underinvestment in public goods provision in places with high fragmentation, mostly because it's really difficult to reach the consensus. So based on what I have observed, one thing we can tackle is to look at, for example, the reason we look at the fundamental factor determining culture, one of the motivation is to see you have different groups with superficially different social norms or culture or other beliefs. Is there anything fundamental that is consensus, that is common between all those groups? You can have different culture, but what I observed is in my research setting, a lot of groups actually share the value of kinship network, the communitarian idea. So if you find the consensus, if you find something common, the deep root, if you find the common deep root of different culture, maybe there is a way to achieve the consensus. So last question is from Marisa, our previous student who is working at Stats Canada. So you can tell, because she's working in Stats Canada, she's interested in public policy. So instead, apart from companies, corporates, is there anything government can do to collaborate with local culture? I haven't had time to answer her question in the breakout room, so I can answer here. So this is a very challenging question, because what we can take from today's discussion is we see the power of community culture. So in my case, or in Dara's case, we can see communities, the local kinship network, they can sort of provide unemployment insurance or all sorts of other insurance to community members. Say, once I become unemployed, some other people in the same kinship network can provide jobs to me. So this is unlike the official unemployment insurance scheme. It's an informal way to secure jobs to the community members. So community has its own mature system to support their members. So some research shows if a public policy is not implemented well, the policy will crowd out some of this community system. So what they observe is if you implement the pension system in some of the communities, the net effect of the pension on the old age people is not large. It's not very positive. And essentially what happens is once you have the formal public policy, the pension policy, some of the informal support community can provide will diminish, because the pension system will attenuate some of the kinship structure. So in this way, I think the takeaway is a pension system, a public policy, some other policies should complement instead of crowding out some of the existing support system in the community.
Pang, I think those governance rebound effects that you're talking about are so important to think about. There's such a balancing act in trying to make those kinds of interventions.
Right.
Eric, from your group, and anything that you wanted to share with us, or others that wanted to share?
Sure. Yeah, I can summarize. We just had time for kind of initial rounds of experiences and insights, and yet a really strong theme emerged. So first of all, we had a very diverse group who had experience in each of higher education, Indigenous social services, local government, working with or representing First Nations, and some of us had been in multiple worked in multiple areas there, and so just showing like the rich experience in the room here. Everybody first brought up the difficulty in understanding and surfacing what the community values are. Even the first step before that, identifying the right communities in some cases, like such as with a university, who is our community, and more like which are our communities. And then understanding, even in a representative position, like being in local government, like Kelly is, where you're representing a community, but still needing to do the active work of understanding what those community values are. And then the comments were that it's a long process and it takes a lot of work to understand that, kind of echoing some of the discussions from the earlier panel. And then the sort of next step is then how do you integrate that into corporate governance? So you've identified the community, you identify what the community values are. That's hard work, that's long work, it's really work that's never done. And yet there's pressure to change corporate governance to be able to respond to those community values coming from investors or others. And maybe the speeds of those two processes aren't always aligned. The slow, long work to understand community values, and then the pressures to be responsive to them. So that creates challenges and work.
I think that's great. And as I was listening, I was thinking it's not just companies and their governance, it's universities and business schools as well, that we face that same challenge of the long and important work of building relationships with the communities around us, but also thinking about how our own governance structures are going to need to adapt and how urgently they need to adapt in order to facilitate that better relationship over time. I wanted to thank everyone so much. I hope you'll join us for our next Ideas at SFU webinar. It's going to be Tuesday, April 12th, where we'll be addressing business, building sustainable value chains. And Sudhir, who you can see here, is going to be our moderator for that session. And I'm looking forward to it. I'll be participating along with other colleagues. We also have a session on May 31st. You'll see some of these are coming up in the chat, focused on strategic competition for global influence, US-China rivalry and its implications for the growth economies of the 21st century. So Eric, who is a panelist today, will be back as the moderator for that session. So the links with information and registration are being shared now, and you'll also get a follow-up email on that. We've also recorded the session, and after some editing, we'll share the link with everyone who's registered for the event. A huge thank you to Dara, to Peng, to Eric, and of course to each of you for joining us today. I also want to thank Dana Higgins, Christine Barnett, and the SFUBeedie Marcom team for doing all the hard work of putting this series together. We're just the talent, we just show up. And so I really thank you. I just delight in the conversation, and thank you so much for coming back and helping us to celebrate and being interested in the research work that we do, because at the end of the day, research really does sit at the heart of what we do at the Beedie School of Business. And so it is our absolute pleasure to be able to share that with all of you. So thank you so much, everyone.